Hello, friends. Welcome back to Feni for the Soul. In today's episode, we are going to meet somebody very interesting. This is Shanthie Mariet D'Souza. Shanti is a PhD in international relations from the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. She's an expert on extremism, terrorism, and insurgency. She's also the founder of the independent research forum Mantraya, a senior research fellow at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in the US, and she's a visiting faculty at the Naval War College in Goa and has done a lot of field work, solid field work in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, Africa, and many parts of the world. So today we are fortunate she's going to be with us and she'll decode this raging war in the Middle East. So I'm going to, get started and without much ado, ask her the important questions. Welcome, Shanti. So, Shanti, my first question to you is, as an international relations expert, um, uh, what do you think was the pressing need for the United States of America to back Israel in attacking Iran?
Well, I think if you look at the turn of events of how things are from the Trump administration 2.0, there has been a lot of fluidity in international relations, a lot of geopolitical flux and uncertainty. So, primarily, following the attack on Israel on October 7th, where Israel continued its attack on Gaza, I think the pressing need is more about understanding Trump presidency in terms of the transactional foreign policy, wherein Israel is an important military partner. US has provided a lot of equipment and weapons to the Israel, and thereby I think a testing became very important. But the larger question is also about the oil dynamics, which is being played out in the Middle East. So it fundamentally leads you to this question about the timing. When at a time when they were very close, and we're talking about a deal which was mediated by Qatar, and things could have been done on a diplomatic scale. But I think Israel was looking for a war, given the fact that Netanyahu has a very low rating now, is looking for another term of elections, and needed a war to justify his continuance in power. And with Trump administration backing Israel, it looks like a larger geopolitical play at hand. If you look at what's happening in terms of the attacks, Iran is now targeting the military targets in the Gulf. And this is primarily to send message to the US. So it looks like there is a kind of a larger Israeli project vis-a-vis the Middle East itself. But primarily the issue was on Iran's nuclear material, and Iran had repeatedly said they have been using it for peaceful purposes and do not intend to use it otherwise. The International Atomic Energy Agency had given them that kind of leeway in terms of the investigations which occurred. So Trump administration could have moved very closely on the diplomatic front rather than backing Israel on a military attack, which has led to the present set of events and has thrown the entire world in a spin.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So many people, Shanti, are calling it a quote unquote senseless war, and the Middle East seems to have literally become crippled. Such a big commercial engine. Now, do you seriously think that Israel and USA did not expect Iran to retaliate?
Well, I think there has been a gross miscalculation. I'm not sure whether the present president of the United States, that is Trump, has anything like futuristic scenario planning. For instance, yesterday Joe Kent, who is the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, resigned because he feels that the war on Iran is not justified. So within the administration, there have been people who have not supported the war, and inside US, it has kicked up a huge debate. So if you look at the long-term planning of, looking at the senseless war, which has sparked a huge financial and energy crisis for the rest of the world, I don't think the Trump administration looked at it very closely. What they were looking at is attacks, neutralizing, decapitating the Iranian regime, and not really anticipating that there would be a replacement to that. And if you look at what Trump has been saying to the reporters and trying to make sense of what he really says, it's really a hard task. It's not easy to understand what Trump really has in mind, but what he's really talking about is looking at a regime change, and the regime change did occur. Because if you look at Iran, which is primarily ideological and theological state. And the present regime had also had fallback options, because if you look again at the attacks which occurred between Iran and Israel, they always had a contingency planning. The regime itself has been very decentralized. Now, if you look at the attacks and the planning which occurs within the military sphere of the regime, they are more decentralized and placed in various provinces. So to actually decimate the entire regime is next to impossible. And as much as you are targeting the leadership, for instance, the killing of Ali Larjani yesterday, it will be replaced by more radical leaders, and that's what we're seeing. So the Mushtaba Khamenei is going to be more radical because of the sense of revenge, which is very much inherent because his family has been killed and Iran's sovereignty has been targeted, and that's non-negotiable. So it is making it very difficult for the Trump administration and the US at this point even to look at a diplomatic off-ramp. Killing of Ali Larjani, who was seen as more of a pragmatist, was an important leader, and he was the head of the security and nuclear issues. And targeting him is not going to help. So I think this is going to be a long, drawn-out, asymmetric warfare, wherein we'll not see an end in sight. And it all depends on how the Gulf states get their acts together and come together to say that maybe there should be a stop to the war, because otherwise we're going to see an escalating economic and financial crisis, in addition to a long-drawn war in which, there are reports again of 2,500 US Marines heading towards the region. So what are they going to do? Are they going to look at the Karg Island? Are they going to escalate? And Iran is not going to sit back and watch, because they equally have that capacity, which they have built over time, having learned lessons from US interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and seeing what's happening in other theaters. I think they're very well prepared for this long drawn-out war.
Thank you, Shanti, for this excellent explanation. It really, demystifies a lot of things. My next question is really, how do you, as an expert, interpret Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel exactly 48 hours before the, war began? I mean, the embarrassing photographs of him kuchikuing literally with Netanyahu on the tarmac. Does it not show India in poor light?
Well, I think I'll not take a subjective or a judgmental position on this, because I'm supposed to be a subject matter expert here. The Prime Minister eventually had been to Israel because he wanted to have a military and a security pact and a strategic partnership in place. And since Benjamin Netanyahu, given that there is this warrant against him by the ICC, can travel, that was one of the rationale why the Prime Minister went. Now, for me, the fundamental question is, when you look at Indian foreign policy today, we started on a moral high ground of non-alignment. During the Cold War, India had held this position of not aligning with any of the superpowers. And then with the end of the Cold War, we moved into more of a neoliberal kind of economic transactionalism in foreign policy, wherein those values did not matter as much as being a realist. And today, I think the realism is at the peak. So we do see that there is a pragmatism which has development at various stages. And we also see multi-alignment in the foreign policy. But the fundamental question is, given the end of the Cold War and the unipolar moment, India had always wanted to maintain its strategic autonomy, which means that it will have friends everywhere, work with all powers, but will maintain its independence. Now, the visit itself, given that it came just 48 hours before the war, shows that there is an alignment of India with US and Israel. And there is a fundamental difference between what you look at tilting towards one side and not taking positions on the other. It took about 10 days for the foreign minister and the prime minister to get the act together, to reach out to Tehran, to send out messages, with which India has a deep, long historical relationship. So I think the whole idea is now that the fact India is facing the consequences of the blockage at the Strait of Hormuz, it will be very difficult if you don't have some kind of relationship or some kind of negotiation with Tehran. And off late, because of the economic and the energy crisis, rising inflation, and the LPG crisis, which is falling, which is a fallout of the consequence of the events, the foreign minister has reached out, and 2 out of the 22 ships have been able to pass. So the timing of the visit is actually definitely important, because it's not that, aligning with one country at the cost of other, when your national interest has to be to balance a lot of interests. Look at the unfolding scenario. There were indicators that Trump administration was preparing for this attack. There was uncertainty in the region. The Indian embassy in Iran had set out an advisory for Indian nationals to leave Iran. So it's not like, rocket science not to know that there's going to be a conflict at hand. And that timing of that visit is definitely questionable, which I think the opposition parties in the parliament has been discussing and should be rightfully done so.
Yeah, Shanti, good points. Thank you so much. I have immediate question on that. One is, of course, my question, basic question is why this. You have answered that the change in our foreign policy or our thinking possibly. But now there's criticism from the opposition, of course, that we are almost subservient to the US because this whole thing about getting the US president giving permission to the PMO or India to buy oil from Russia. That was the latest, and even in this whole scenario, not taking a firm stand, like say somebody like Spain has done, or some other countries have done. Why is this change happened? I wanted a little more clarity on that. Change in
Well, I
foreign
think it's
policy. Why are
fundamentally
we
because
now
of the
not as black and white as we used to be in, say, Indira Gandhi's time?
Well, I think that fundamental world order has changed, and we are in a very difficult and different world order today. Those days, it was a bipolar world between the US and the USSR. And India took a position not taking sides till the time the 1971 war, when the USS Enterprise entered Bay of Bengal, and Indira Gandhi was compelled to reach out to the Soviets and sign the Treaty of Friendship. And thereby, India was seen to be tilted towards Soviet. But still, India maintained its independence in foreign policy, be it from the crisis of PL 480, where India was literally short on food, till the wars. India maintained its independence in its foreign policy. But of late, I think it's the neoliberal and the economic criteria which is driving the foreign policy, wherein it's the profit motive. So basically, with the US, it's been the trade, and with the present Trump administration, which has been a complete turnaround from what the Prime Minister's relationship with Trump had been in the first administration. So you do see that the tariffs were imposed, and the tariffs were very high on India. Likewise, when the attacks occurred in Kashmir, and the Trump administration's tilt towards Pakistan left India in a scenario where it didn't look like it didn't have friends anymore. So it was a very difficult scenario in terms of what's happening in the world order today. There's a lot of flux. There's a lot of uncertainty. We are looking at a emerging world order which is multipolar in lot many ways, and India is aspiring to be one of the poles, and for which I think India shouldn't be subservient to any country, but should be independent and be looking inward and building its strength, and from the position of strength. Talking, for instance, if Trump administration is telling India that you can not buy oil from Iran, we stop buying oil from Iran and we stop buying oil from Russia, and there's a turnaround now, and you are allowed to. But that really doesn't speak much for a country which is aspiring to be a great power. So I think we need to have independence in our foreign policy, look at contingency planning, do some future scenario building exercises inside the foreign policy, and I think develop more expertise and forward-looking thinking in the sense of, how things are going to unfold. It's a changing world order, and I think we have to be prepared for that.
Thank you, Shanti, once again. There was this very embarrassing situation. About, or everyone has spoken about it. India's complete silence when the Iranian naval ship was torpedoed so close to India's mainland, when they were actually guests of the Indian Navy and India, and that. How do you explain that silence? Because it was, terribly embarrassing and shameful.
Well, I think one thing is to look at it very technically. So technically, if you look at it, it was not in the India's EEZ, it was in international waters, and thereby Sri Lanka went ahead rescued. So we can wash our hands off saying that India didn't have knowledge of it. Did occur very close to Indian waters, so India is not responsible. As said, it was a part of an exercise, Milan exercise, and the ship was traveling from India, participating in that exercise. Thereby, there was some kind of moral authority or a comradeship in terms of giving some kind of protection. And I think following that incident, India has provided docking of 2 more of the Iranian ships, which have asked for assistance. But with this particular ship, I think it did set this in symbolic message in terms of India claiming to be a net security provider in the Indian Ocean. And this occurred in the Indian Ocean, which actually jolted a lot of the foreign policy wonks who thought that the war is occurring in the Middle East will not touch the Indian shores, will not affect India. It did, right down in the Indian South, in the Indian Ocean, where it is seen as India being a big power providing security. And I think India failed in that, at least in terms of messaging. There was not one word sent to Washington or voiced any opinion about that attack. Likewise, when Iran was attacked and the entire leadership was targeted, not a single message which came out. So I think this actually sends out a signal that you are aligned more with the US and Israel, and you are ready to pay the cost for that. And for me, it's more worrisome because those costs could be huge. India cannot be identified with any country. India has to have its own strategic autonomy and its own independence, and should be able to provide security if a ship which has participated in a naval exercises is being attacked. And a certain amount of foresight into or contingency planning, which I was talking about, or looking at scenario building, because I mean, our forces do a lot in terms of war gaming and simulation exercises. I think there should be a certain understanding that when the war starts somewhere, anyone can be a target. It could be an Indian ship tomorrow, and then if someone else has to wash their hands off in a similar situation, then how do you take it up? And more importantly, Rahul, I think it's about question about India wanting a seat at the UN Security Council, and you think that UN is not being able to do, but you didn't even take it up there. So I think there are some forums, and mind you, again, India is a chairman of BRICS, and the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa forum. India has taken up that position. So did India voice its opinion on any of these issues, right from torpedoing to the attacks and killing of the regime, however imperfect or violent the regime was? But this is not the way international law is practiced or let any hegemon. For instance, Stephen Walt in Harvard calls the US under Trump administration a predatory hegemon. So we are letting a predatory hegemon do things all over the world, and we are not even voicing the opinion, but looking like someone who's being subservient to the US. I think that is problem.
Surely, surely. You're spot on, Shanti, with your analysis. Almost the final questions. Trump has got zero support from these major NATO countries. Because they refuse to send their navies to secure the Gulf of Hormuz. Isn't that mud on Trump's face?
It is. I think it's not Gulf of Hormuz, it's Strait of Hormuz. And
Strait
if you
of
look at
Hormuz.
the
Sorry.
NATO countries today, it's yeah. If you look at NATO countries and their participation with what Trump is doing all over the world, I think there has been no consultation. For instance, the German Chancellor has very clearly said that there was no consultation before getting into the war. Now, if you look at the war in Afghanistan, which occurred following the attacks in the US homeland on September 11th, 2001, it was justified as a just war. There was a reason why US could thought of intervening. But it went ahead without UN approval, even without NATO approval. But the NATO countries fell in line because there was Article 5 of NATO, which says attack on one is attack on all. But this was not an attack on the US, that the NATO countries should fall in line. Secondly, they don't want to be dragged endlessly into the war. And mind you, and this is at a scenario where Russia and Ukraine conflict is ongoing, and Russia is strengthening its position. So there are concerns inside Europe, be it from their security point of view, with what Russia is doing and how Russia is getting more powerful, in terms of the energy crisis which is unfolding inside Europe, and more importantly, to drag into a war which they feel is totally unjustified. So countries have taken position. For instance, Spain has declined. France and Germany remain opposed. UK again did not, fall in line when Trump ordered, and it's a very different scenario from what NATO was created. And if you look at this, I think it is a mud in the face for Trump. But more importantly, it's a question about the transatlantic alliance, because Trump never promised NATO any kind of help. And today, if Trump is asking NATO for help, it means it has to be a just war. It has to fall into the line of Article 5 of the NATO, and it isn't so. So it's natural that this will not be a part of it.
Thank you, thank you. So one final question: where do you think this war is headed? I mean, you said it's going to be a long, protracted war, but what are going to be the immediate ramifications?
Well, as you see, the immediate ramifications would be the security. I mean, in case of Iran further tightening and not letting the ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz, there's going to be energy crisis unfolding. There'll be an economic crisis. There will be a cyber security issues, which will have economic and ramifications for India. For instance, we have more than 10 billion diaspora there, and the remittances which are coming from that diaspora in terms of the GDP is almost 0.5%, which is going to impact India on in a large scale. But I think on the whole, we are going to see a strengthening of Russia and China from this conflict. We are going to see US going through internal turmoil, which would lead to its impact on its own power potential. And thereby, I think we do see a decline in the American hegemony as the war prolongs. Israel is going to take the hit. I mean, the Iranian targets are reaching Israel now. It's not that these were not calculated. There must be some kind of estimation occurring in terms of how the warfare is going to work. But it's more of an asymmetric warfare, which will be long drawn out. And I don't see it coming very close to an end, as I pointed out, because the diplomatic off-ramp, which was available right from negotiation initiated by Qatar to the killing of Ali Lajani, I think it's going to be a more troublesome regime. There's not going to be a protest which will inside Iran, which will help a regime change. Not neutralizing the present regime will lead to any kind of change scenario. So we are going to long drawn out conflict, and I think till the point be a wild card. Tomorrow it decides and it says that we have won, and the Iranians say we have not won. In that sense, you have not won. So I think it's going to be a long drawn out war. So let's see how things unfold. But I don't see this really de-escalating at this point of time. So it's a little too early to say well how long this will prolong, but it's going to be a very different war, an asymmetric war, which will be long drawn out and will have financial, energy, and economic costs for all the countries involved.
Thank you so much, Shanti, for giving us your time. Thank you so much and decoding this, complex
Most
situation.
welcome.
Bye. Thank you.